Trust donates a book on the topic to the school library and a book on the topic to the town library as well. We're pleased to have our speaker this evening. Dr. Stoner earned her BS in zoology at Duke University and her PhD in entomology at Cornell University. She has worked at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station since 1987 and has expertise in developing alternatives to insecticides for managing vegetable insects, working with organic farmers and land care professionals on pest management, and studying the exposure of pollinators to pesticides in pollen and nectar. Her 2 lines of research studying the effects of insecticides on pollinators like bees and researching alternative ways to manage insect pests qualify her very well to talk about the decline in the number of pollinators, a problem we hear about in the media, and to explain what we can do to help make sure that there will be healthy populations of pollinating insects in the years to come. It gives me great pleasure to present Dr. Kimberly Stoner.
Thank you. And he has some handouts. I wasn't expecting this many people, so I didn't bring enough handouts for everyone. But
Well, you're in Hartland now, there are people.
but maybe you guys can share the handouts. So, as he said, there's a lot of talk about insects, about saving the pollinators these days, and people are very concerned about bees, and people are always asking me about how do we save the bees. And so this is just a collection of sort of memes I collected off the internet. My personal favorite is, "If we die, we're taking you with us." And even the White House has had bees now for several years. And this past summer, the White House developed a pollinator strategy. So during National Pollinator Week in June, the White House released their strategy for helping pollinators. And a very prominent part of it is planting more pollinator habitat, 7 million acres of pollinator habitat, and then also changing how we manage federal lands in order to make the lands more usable for pollinators, doing more research and doing more outreach. So those are all things that the executive branch can do without any need for approval from Congress, because we all know that the executive branch and Congress don't get along very well. So that's something that will be happening, I think, in the next few years. So why do people care about bees? So are there beekeepers in the room? Are there some beekeepers in the room? Oh yeah, there's a number of beekeepers in the room. Yeah, including some small ones. So people care about bees and brought actually honeybees to this country because they wanted to have the products of the hive. They wanted to have honey, they wanted to have beeswax. Actually, beeswax was really important. A lot of people don't realize that. And then since that time, people have realized the important role of bees for pollination of our food crops. And then there's conservation of biodiversity. Obviously, this is a talk sponsored by the Land Trust. So the Land Trust is very interested in having healthy ecosystems and conserving biodiversity. And the other reason to care about bees is because they are extremely cool. I will convince you. People, however, are afraid of bees. So I work at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, and we have an insect inquiry office. So people can call up the experiment station and ask about any kind of insect problem that they have and get advice. And we get a lot of calls about bees. Mostly people are mistaken when they call about bees, and they're actually, the problem is yellow jackets or other wasps. But sometimes they are calling about bees that are actually really harmless. So I'll talk some about that. But, this is like people's nightmare, the kid running away from the bees, carrying the flowers. So what bees sting? Stinging is an adaptation of social insects. So the social insects are the ones that have large colonies and they have resources to defend. So if you think about a honeybee hive, they have all this stored honey. They have the larvae of the bees. So the larvae are developing inside that hive, and that is sort of soft, mushy, defenseless protein. So the bees are stinging to defend that. And in fact, bears and skunks and a lot of vertebrates like us like to take apart honeybee hives in order to eat that protein as well as the honey. And they have a lot of workers. They have a large number of workers, so they can expend workers defending the colony without affecting the population of the colony too much. So that's the situation with the social insects. So that's honeybees. Bumblebees are social too, but they don't have as large colonies as honeybees. But most bees and most wasps too are solitary. So that means that each female makes her own nest. Instead of having a big social nest, each female is making her own nest. And in those situations, they're very reluctant to sting because they don't have a big nest with lots of resources to defend. And the females can't, give up their lives to defend their little tiny nest. And another thing that a lot of people don't know is males cannot sting. Stinger is a modified ovipositor, so it's only the females that can sting. So some solitary bees nest in aggregations, and I'll show you some pictures of that. So each female is sort of like a street with lots of houses on it. Each house has its own family, but there's lots of houses together. But that doesn't make them more likely to sting. So even when there's large aggregations, they don't necessarily sting. So the bees that are most likely to sting are honeybees. And that's, again, because they have a big colony, they have a lot of resources. Bumblebees are social too. They can sting. Honeybees are the only bees that leave behind their stinger when they sting, so that the worker just dies after she leaves behind her stinger. Bumblebees, if they are inclined to sting you, can sting you more than once because they don't leave their stinger behind. But they're very reluctant to sting you. I've done a lot of work with bumblebees, collected them off flowers. They're just really reluctant to sting because their colonies are very small and they can't really expend their workers defending them. So, the beekeepers in the audience know what this is. This is a frame that comes out of a hive, and this has a bunch of the different things that beekeepers like to see in a frame. So it has capped brood, it has pollen. So they talk about having like a sunrise cap. So there's like capped brood in the center, and there's the cells that look empty probably have eggs or small larvae in them. And then there's pollen around the outside of that, and then there's capped honey on the outside of that. So those are all the resources that you can see in a honeybee hive. And we get a lot of our ideas about bees from honeybees because those are the bees that we're most familiar with. Honeybees are weird. Honeybees are not anything like any of our native bees. So they came from overseas. They evolved in Asia. The group that honeybees belong to evolved in Asia. Honeybees were in Africa and then were brought to Europe. They've been in Europe like 10,000 years, so they're well adapted in Europe. And then European races of the honeybees were brought here to the United States. They overwinter as a tight cluster of workers in the hive. So one reason why they need to store honey is because they overwinter as thousands of workers, and they don't like go to sleep or go dormant like most insects. They are in the hive. They are keeping the hive warm, like 93 degrees warm. They are burning all that honey as fuel, essentially, to keep themselves warm over the winter. None of our native bees do this. And then they reproduce by swarming. So a colony will throw off a swarm that has a queen and workers, and it's sort of like colonies of yeast budding off or something like that. So the individual bees don't send off like a queen to start a new colony, which is what bumblebees do, actually. They send off a whole chunk of the colony with the queen and the workers together. And then they have all this really fascinating communication within the colony. So people have been studying this for centuries now. The foragers, the foraging honeybees, can come back and communicate to the other bees where the good resources are. They do this waggle dance. And people have studied this waggle dance for so long that bee researchers can watch inside the hive. They can like use these special lights that the bees can't see and watch inside the hive and see what the bees are, what the waggle dance is doing, and can figure out what the bees are communicating, what source of honey or place for the swarm to go to that the bees are communicating. So they have this elaborate system of communication that other bees don't have. So people are concerned because bees have been declining. But this is partly a study, a graph to show you that, and partly a study in how different kinds of ways of graphing things can show you different things. So if you look at this graph, I'm not sure if you can see this from the back, but it starts in 1940, and the bottom of the graph is 2 million colonies of honeybees. So in the 1940s, there were like 6 million honeybee hives in the US, and they've been declining since. But they've been declining over a long time. And that probably has more to do with economics than it does with anything else. For the whole period up until the 1980s, has to do with the price of honey being low, having lots of sugar substitutes, having lots of other sources of sugar, importing honey from other countries that was cheap, lots of things like that. Then when you get to the 1980s, there's a big decline, and that has to do with the varroa mite. So there's a parasitic mite that was accidentally, I guess, presumably accidentally brought into the country that is just really devastating to honeybees. So the mite itself takes a big toll, and then the mite, we now know, transmits all these viruses. There's now like 21 different viruses that we know about, and many of them are spread by these varroa mites. So that caused that huge decline. Then what most people know about is colony collapse disorder, which happened around here. And you can see that on the grand scheme of things, has not been that huge a decline. And so this is a different scale of graph. So the time starts with 1990, and the bottom of the graph is 0. So 2 million is up there. And you can see that the honeybees are not currently crashing. And a big part of this is actually that so many people want to do something about bees. So there's so many people who want to be beekeepers that the beekeeping organizations that have always offered courses on how to get started in bees. They used to have like 20 people come to those courses, and then the last few years they've had like 150 people come to those courses. So that's a part of it, is that there's just so many people who want to keep bees. Another aspect is that the economics have changed. So the price that beekeepers can get, the large beekeepers, the large commercial beekeepers can get for pollination services has gone up. The price of honey has gone up. So there are still problems, even though that graph doesn't look that way. There are still problems. So these are, this is from surveys of beekeepers done by a program that's called Bee Informed. And there are still losses every year. So the blue part of the column is what the beekeepers consider to be an acceptable loss, and the total column is the amount of loss that they measured. And so we've been losing 20 to 35% of the bees each year. Beekeepers have ways they can make that up. So they can split their hives, they can bring in new queens, they have ways to make up their losses. And that's what they've been doing. So that's why it's been overall relatively stable. But so even here in Connecticut, it's still a problem. We still lose a lot of colonies. So these are also from the Bee Informed survey. So on the order of half of the colonies in the state we've been losing each year according to this survey. So the summary of what's going on with bees is, actually, let me see if this will work a little bit. Is this any louder at all? Slightly louder. Okay. So beekeepers are still having a hard time. So it's not so much the bees as the beekeepers that are having a hard time, because they have to make up all these losses all the time. But the price, as I said, the economics have been favoring them. The price of honey's gone up, the price of pollination services has gone up. So they keep on plugging, at least some of them keep on plugging, because it's worth it, because the economics favor them. So, as I said, honeybees are completely different from all the other bees we have here. So we have had historically 328 different species of bees. We're actually working on a scientific paper to add 13 more state records to that list, so we'll have 341 bees on the checklist for Connecticut. And a few of them come from other countries. In addition to honeybees, there are a few other that have been imported either on purpose or accidentally. So we have one species of honeybee. We have had historically 14 species of bumblebees. I'll talk about that. We're losing species of bumblebees. And I'll show you examples of some of the other kinds of bees. I'm not going to show you all the different other kinds of bees. There's sweat bees in particular. There are hundreds of species of sweat bees. So, and mostly people don't know what they look like. But I'll show you a few of the different kinds. So these are bumblebees, and this is the bumblebee life cycle. So, as I said, bumblebees are social, but in particular, they overwinter very differently from honeybees. So, what is going on at this time of year is a mated queen is down in the ground somewhere, finding a little hole to spend the winter. And that's what overwinters, not some big colony like with honeybees, but just mated queens. So those mated queens will come out in the spring, and each mated queen has to do everything. She has to find a nesting site. So actually that's why you see bumblebees scanning the ground a lot in the spring, is they're looking for nesting sites. She has to find a nesting site, establish a nest. She goes out, does all the foraging, gets the nectar, gets the pollen, makes the little wax containers that they use for rearing their larvae. And she has to incubate the nest too. So she has a patch on her belly that is up against the larvae to keep them warm enough so that they will develop. So she has to do all of that stuff. And then once she gets one cohort of workers going, then she becomes more like a honeybee queen. Then she stays in the nest, and the workers go out and do the foraging and take care of the larvae and build the nest and all that kind of thing. And then the colony grows over the course of the season, and at some point, there's a signal and the colony starts to produce the reproductive, so it starts to produce the new queens and males. And they go out, do some foraging, they mate, and everybody else dies other than the mated queen. So all of the males die, all of the workers die, and just the mated queens then make it through the next year. It's very important that there's the really good nutrition for those mated queens, because unlike honeybees, they don't have all that stored honey as a resource. All the stored energy that she has is what's in her fat bodies, in her own body. So she's got to bulk up before the winter. So, bumblebees are in trouble. Bumblebees are declining in species diversity around the world. That doesn't necessarily mean that there are fewer total bumblebees. There are some species that are doing very well, but there are certainly species that were formerly common, including species that were formerly common here in Connecticut, that we no longer see here, that have been so restricted in range and abundance that we never see them. And the same thing is well documented, way better actually documented in Europe as here in North America. And there's also information suggesting the same thing is happening in China and in Latin America. So these are some of our species of concern here in Connecticut. So Bombus ashtoni was actually a parasitic bee. It's what we call a cuckoo bee or a kleptoparasitic bee. So like cuckoos will lay their eggs in the nests of other birds, there are bumblebees that lay their eggs in the nests of other bumblebees. So, so that and the species that it was parasitizing are declining, so that bee is declining. But Bombus aphanus was a really common pollinator, pollinated crops, it's been a species of special concern for a long time. The DEEP just put out their new endangered species list, and on that list they call it likely extirpated, since nobody has seen it since 1997. It exists still in a few places that they've found little patches of it in Wisconsin and in Illinois, but nobody has seen any Bombus aphanus in this part of the world for years and years now. Bombus terricola is a species is now considered threatened, or was a species of special concern before. It is actually making a comeback in some parts of New England, in Maine and in New Hampshire. They're starting to see Bombus terricola, but it was way down for a long time. And we still haven't seen any in Connecticut since 2009. And then Bombus pennsylvanicus was another actually fairly rare bumblebee in this part of the world that's not been seen for a number of years. So why are these bees declining? What's happening with honeybees? What's happening with bumblebees? The consensus is that there's a whole mix of things that are going on. Pesticides, as I'll talk about at the end of the talk, seem to be part of the problem. Clearly for honeybees, varroa mites are a major part of the problem. The bee inspector, who also works at the experiment station with me, says, you know, the first thing he says when he goes to talk to beekeepers is, what's your mite count? Because if they aren't managing their varroa mites, they're going to lose their bees. So there are other pests and diseases. So I mentioned the viruses. There is Nosema cerani, which is a microsporidian. There are some other pathogens in bumblebees that may have come from commercial bumblebees. So there are bumblebees that you can buy in a box, and that was originally developed for greenhouse growers, like greenhouse tomato growers, to pollinate their crops. But when they were getting to the point where they could commercialize the bumblebees, apparently they had problems managing the pathogens of the bumblebees. So those commercialized bumblebees seem to have spread some pathogens to other bumblebees. So that may be a part of it. A big part of it is lack of good habitat. So as we've developed larger and larger monocultures, maybe not so much here in Connecticut, but in other parts of the country, like in the Midwest, there's less habitat for the bees. There's not flowering resources for them to feed on all year round. I mean, not all year round, but all through the growing season. Pesticides, I'll talk more about that. Climate change, there was just a paper out looking at how climate change was affecting bumblebees, and it seems that in the southern parts of their range, the bumblebees are dying off, and they're not expanding into the northern parts of their, beyond where their range was before very effectively. So all of these things are probably part of the picture. Okay, so now we'll talk about solitary bees. As I said, most species of bees are solitary bees. So, as I also said, so each female creates her own nest. This diagram is for a ground nesting bee, but they can nest in different environments. There are bees that nest in hollow stems, in wood, in previously made tunnels in wood, all different kinds of places. So a solitary bee at this time of year is in the ground, typically in a pre-pupal or pupal stage. So it's right now in this stage here, the pupal stage. And then at the appropriate time, depending on the life cycle of the bee, the adults, it molts to a pupal stage, then molts to an adult. The adults come out of whatever nesting environment and mate and forage for a while, and then the females make new nests. And so what she will do is she will go out and get pollen and nectar, and she mixes those together and makes a ball, and puts that ball of mixed pollen and nectar into a nesting cell. So for the ground nesting bees, they do something like this. So they have a tunnel that goes down into the ground, and they have little pockets that come off of that tunnel. And that's, each pocket is a cell, and it gets one ball of pollen and nectar and one egg laid in it, an egg laid in the little ball. And then the female just closes that off, and she goes on to make more cells. So then the larva develops on its own and feeds on that pollen ball and goes to the stage of being a prepupa, and then waits until the next year. So this is an example. This is a ground nesting bee. This is a very common ground nesting bee called Calides. That's the genus name. There are several different species in Connecticut. And there are a lot of them that are active in the spring and very important pollinators of spring blooming crops. And remember I talked about that solitary bees can have aggregations. So this group of bees tends to have large aggregations. So when people call us up in April, or the end of March and the beginning of April at the experiment station, and they say, I have bees nesting in the ground, they're usually talking about this species of bee, or this genus of bee, I should say. I've gotten calls like from an elementary school in Southington where they had thousands and thousands of these nests in their schoolyard. These are completely harmless bees. There's like no record of these bees ever stinging anybody. So we try and convince people, A, these are good pollinators, B, they're not going to sting your kids. I've observed them, I've dug up their nests, I've done all kinds of things, they've never stung me. And they're also just really cute bees. So here they are with their little heads sticking up like prairie dogs up there. And it's got this nice heart-shaped face. But here's an example of, a small aggregation. And I see these, I live in New Haven, walking around on the streets in New Haven. I see these in the little kill strips between the sidewalk and the street. I see bunches of these nests. They're just like all over the place. So these are good bees. Don't kill them. So then there are bees that are, they're called the hairy belly bees. That's that whole family, Megachilidae, because they have the specialized hairs for collecting pollen. Instead of having them on their legs, like honeybees do and bumblebees do, they have them on the undersides of their abdomen. That's where they collect the pollen. And so many of these are cavity nesting bees, so they're in, in nature they would be in hollow stems, but people make habitats for them to nest. So they put out straws of the right diameter and length, and the bees will nest in those straws. And they also can be important pollinators. So sometimes people bring in colonies of those bees that have nested in man-made straws and put them in orchards as a way to pollinate the orchards, because they're certain species anyway are spring active bees. And then, so here's an example. So here are some straws, and these are called mason bees, this group, because they close off each of their cells in the hollow tube with mud. So they gather mud and close off a cell, and then when they start a new cell, they go out and get pollen and nectar, make a little ball, and then close off that cell. And then when this tube is completely closed off, then they move on to another cell. Okay, so this is switching to the what can you plant for bees part of the talk. So this is one of my heroes, Dr. Marla Spivak, who has done research on honeybees for many years. And she got the MacArthur Genius Award a few years ago. And she says there are two things each and every one of us can do to help bee populations. We can plant bee-friendly flowers in our gardens without pesticides, and we can encourage our communities to plant pollinator habitat, flowers in all kinds of other environments, community gardens, roadsides, all sorts of places. So if we want to plant for bees, the first thing we have to figure out is what is our goal? Because we could be planting for honeybees. If you're beekeepers, then you're thinking about planting for honeybees. We could be planting for conserving bumblebees. We could be concerned, I don't know how many farmers there are in the room, but we could be concerned about agricultural pollination of our crops. Or we could be concerned about a wider sort of ecological issue about conservation of good plant pollinator networks. So, honeybees are not native, so they don't really care whether you plant native plants or not. They even use invasive plants. Actually, beekeepers are rather fond of some invasive plants. They need bloom through a long season because they're active for a long time from the warm days in March all the way through the warm days in October. They are attracted to large sources, so they use that waggle dance to communicate big sources of nectar to each other, or big sources of pollen. So in their natural environment where they evolved, they were looking for like the big blooming trees. And in our environment, they're looking for big fields of blooming all at the same time. So that makes them a good agricultural pollinator. But it also means that like little tiny plantings in your yard may not attract honeybees as much as it may attract other bees. And they prefer open flowers. There are some flowers that they can't really use because the corolla is too long. They don't have long enough tongues to get down there into the corolla. And there are others that only release their pollen when they're buzzed. So bumblebees can do this. They can hang onto the flower and vibrate their wing muscles like a tuning fork, and that causes certain flowers to release their pollen. Honeybees can't do that. And so, as I said, they use trees a lot. And a lot of people, when they think of planting for bees, they're thinking about herbaceous flowering plants. But honeybees, maple is actually a major honey flow for that beekeepers are quite aware of. So even though maple is really a wind-pollinated plant, that's why it produces tons of pollen, honeybees use it. And willows too. Willows I'll talk about a number of times because willows are good for a lot of different bees. So then if you want to plant for bumblebees, as I said, they have a colony that's active through their growing season, but there are critical periods. So when that overwintered queen comes out of the nest and she's got to collect nectar and pollen and do it all not very far from her nest because she's got all these other things to do, that's a really critical period, is early spring blooming flowers. And then another critical period is when the queens are getting ready to go through the winter and they need to feed on good sources of pollen and nectar in order to bulk up, in order to make it through the winter and then make it and still have stored energy to make it through that early spring. So that's really important. Those periods are really important. And then, as I mentioned, they can buzz flowers, and they can use longer corolla flowers than the honeybees, because they, at least some species anyway, have long tongues. So here's a good example, relevant up until a few weeks ago, goldenrod and the late asters. So there are about 10 bumblebees in that picture of goldenrod. So goldenrod is another plant that's good for lots and lots of different bees. Also very popular with beekeepers for honeybees, has a lot of specialist solitary bees, just a good plant. So agricultural pollination. So there are, a lot of people think we're totally dependent on honeybees for agricultural pollination, but that's not true. There are a lot of other bees, bumblebees and solitary bees that are also important for pollination. This is a graph that comes from Virginia, but I've seen similar things in other places in the Northeast. So the light blue slice of the pie is the part of pollination that's done by honeybees. So you can see that that ranges from like 17% to about 32%. And then the dark blue part is the part that's done by bumblebees. The yellow part is done by a mix of medium size, and then the green is the small bees, the many different species of like sweat bees that I mentioned that are out there. So actually in cucurbit, she includes watermelons and cucumbers as well as squash. I do research on squash and effective pollination. And in that case, something on the order of 2/3 of the pollination is done by bumblebees. About 20% of it is done by squash bees, which is a bee that specializes in squash. It feeds its larvae only the pollen from squash. And then the remainder is done by honeybees. So I've done research on vegetable farms. I'm, as was mentioned in my introduction, by background, I'm a vegetable entomologist. So I looked at what kinds of flowering resources there are on vegetable farms, herbs, cut flowers, and a lot of things that you might not think of as good resources. For example, things that are relatively easy to do, like leaving a lot of clover in the alleyways where people are driving their tractors, things like that. And so I produced a couple of publications that are on the list, the resources that were handed out to you. One is what kinds of flowers we found and what kinds of bees were on it. And then the other one is taking it the other way and looking at all the different species of bees. We found 98 different species of bees, and then what flowers they were using. And another aspect then is to think about the native bee conservation and healthy plant pollinator networks. And people now are studying this a lot, looking at native plants and bees and trying to figure out kind of what are the key plants to plant that will really make a difference. And there are different criteria. So you can look at what kinds of native plants have the greatest number of different bee species, what ones are blooming and producing pollen and nectar for the longest time, which ones just have the highest total number of bees, and the greatest number of unique interactions. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So a unique interaction, one kind of unique interaction is if the bee is specialized. So there are some bees, like the squash bee I just mentioned, there are some bees that will only feed their larvae the pollen of certain species of plants. They're specialist bees. And these are a couple of plants that have their own specialist bees. The plants are not specialists. The plants attract a wide diversity of different bees. One of them, these two just happen to be in my yard. So one is golden Alexanders, and they have their own ground nesting solitary bee. And the other is New York ironweed, which also has its own ground nesting solitary bee. So that's one reason why I have the handout that you got that has a list of different plants that have their own specialists. So that if you're planting native plants and you choose those, you're maximizing the amount of diversity, because those will attract generalist bees, and they'll also attract these specialist bees that otherwise are not going to have resources if you don't plant those particular groups of plants. So, some native plants that do it all, that attract specialists and generalists. This is the short list. I've given you the long list in your handout, but a short list is willows, blueberries, sunflowers, bee balm, goldenrods, and the American aster. So like New England aster, New York aster, there's actually a lot of different kinds of asters. But those are plants that really maximize diversity. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears again and talk about pesticides. So I don't know if you are on the same environmentalist lists that I'm on, but I have been getting these messages for years now saying we need to ban these pesticides, this group of pesticides, the neonicotinoids, because of their effects on bees. So this, as I will show you, is still kind of an open scientific question, but we are accumulating a lot of information about this group of insecticides. So, what are they? So, part of the concern is that they're systemic insecticides. So that means you can apply them to any part of the plant and they travel through the plant. So, and they're called neonicotinoids because they operate on the same receptor in the insect nervous system as nicotine. But you can apply the neonicotinoids to seed, you can apply it to soil, and the roots will take it up and it will travel through the plant. You can apply them to the bark of trees, you can inject them into trees. There's lots of different ways to apply them. And then there's a group that's highly toxic to bees and another group that's less toxic to bees. So, one reason why this is such a big concern is that these are used on a huge scale. Because they can be used as seed treatments, and they have, in this country anyway, have been sort of the default seed treatment. So essentially all all of the corn seed, a large fraction of the soybean seed, canola seed, wheat, cotton have been treated. So a few years ago, people were saying that corn farmers who weren't organic, so they weren't like just buying out of the organic seed supply, really couldn't get corn seed that wasn't already pre-treated with these pesticides. So as a result, this group of insecticides has been applied to the greatest area in the United States of any insecticide group ever, more than DDT or any of those. So as I said, they can be applied in lots of different ways. So they're applied actually to lots of different crops. But the really huge use is the seed treatments. And another thing that makes them very controversial is that they've been banned in Europe. So the three most toxic ones have been banned in Europe for the last couple of years. They're actually right now reviewing whether to extend that ban because there was a moratorium for a couple of years. And there's a huge amount of research coming out of Europe right now because they're deciding whether to extend that ban. So that all started, and actually I got interested in this by reading about French beekeepers who were marching on Paris, saying these pesticides are killing our bees. And I'm a Francophile. I was traveling in France, and I read about this, and I thought, we use those same insecticides in this country. Why aren't people concerned about it in this country? So that's how I started doing this research. So one aspect is acute toxicity. So you always have to remember the neonicotinoids are not unique amongst insecticides in killing bees. Pretty much any broad spectrum insecticide, if it's used in such a way that the bees come in direct contact with it, will kill bees. Because bees are insects and it's difficult to make insecticides that will kill certain insects and not other insects. But what has emerged over years of research is that a big part of the problem with these seed treatments is dust. So the corn farmers planting these on a big scale, they are running the seeds through this machinery, and they are also running lubricant like talc or graphite through the machinery, and that was abrading the dust off. And that was highly concentrated insecticide in the form of dust that was drifting around. And it may have come in contact with the bees directly. Bees are like little dust mops because they have all those little hairs for picking up pollen. And so the dust could land directly on the bees, or it could drift onto the flowers that the bees were using, or into the soil and the surrounding areas. So as I mentioned, a couple of years ago, over 95% of the 97 million acres of corn in the United States was planted with these treated seeds. So, anything on that scale, you're going to start to find out what the problems are. And there are good reasons, actually, why people started using neonicotinoids. They're much less toxic to people than the organophosphates they replaced and the carbamates they replaced. And there's a worker safety issue. So if you're treating the seeds and putting them directly in the ground, you're not spraying the pesticide all over, you're not having people come in contact with it. So there are good reasons why we use those pesticides. But using them on this scale, you start to see what the effects are. So there was also a highly publicized event in Oregon where some landscape contractors sprayed linden trees. And there were a lot of mistakes made. The linden trees were in bloom when they sprayed them. And that's contrary, of course, to the label. And killed on the order of 50,000 bumblebees. And they did this in just outside of Portland, Oregon, which is the headquarters of Xerces, which is an invertebrate conservation organization. So one of the people from Xerces came by and saw 50,000 dead bumblebees, and they, you have to wonder kind of how often this happens in situations which are not sort of ideal for being discovered. So here they are putting nets on the linden trees, because another thing about these systemic insecticides is they persist for a long time. So it's not like the insecticides that you spray and then once they're dry, the bees are not going to come in contact with them anymore. These get incorporated in the plant and would continue to be in the nectar and pollen for, you know, the rest of the blooming period at least, and maybe longer. So they had to try and keep the bumblebees out of these trees because it was killing all bumblebees. So the acute toxicity is pretty clear, but a lot of the debate is actually about the chronic toxicity and what is really, at what level are the bees exposed in the field and what effects do they have? And this is actually what I do research on too. So there's a ton of research on this. There are literally hundreds of papers coming out about this. But they're overwhelmingly on seed-treated crops and with one of these neonicotinoids, imidacloprid, and overwhelmingly on honeybees. So we're just now really starting to get studies, good studies on bumblebees. And so as I'll mention at the end, we're seeing that the effects on honeybees and bumblebees are actually quite different. So there's also been a lot of laboratory studies looking at effects on bees, and there are so many effects that people can find in the laboratory. So there's delay in larval development, lots of changes in behavior and learning and foraging activity and feeding activity, effects on their immune systems, effects on their survival over the winter, lots of sublethal effects. So the research that I have been doing is looking at how they're exposed and what levels they're exposed to. So I did experiments where we treated squash the same way farmers would have done it at the time, which was applying it to the soil and planting in that soil, and then measuring the amount of neonicotinoids in the pollen and nectar. We also looked at how bees were exposed by collecting pollen. So beekeepers have devised all these clever devices, and one of them is a pollen trap. So you can put a pollen trap in there and collect the pollen that the bees have just collected in the field and sort of intercept it before they can store it in their hive. And then you can take samples of that and measure the amount of pesticides that are in there. And we looked at a whole range of pesticides, not just the neonicotinoids. And now what I'm currently doing is looking at ornamental plants, because the rates that can be applied to ornamental plants, according to the label, so the law, are actually much higher per unit area than the rates that farmers can use. So we're looking at the methods used in nurseries to treat ornamentals like rhododendrons and how much is in the pollen and nectar. And we actually put bees out in ornamental nurseries, and we're going to we have collected samples from the bees, and we're analyzing those to see what plants the bees are using and how they're exposed to the pesticides, and recording which plants they're using at different times over the season. So this is an example of how actually the ornamental plant industry and the landscape industry is changing. So there has been research looking at clothianidin, which is one of the neonicotinoids, and this is with bumblebees, and this is the number of dead workers in the hive, and that's the number of foraging bees for clothianidin, and this is chlorotraniliprole, and this is the control, untreated. So it used to be when you would go to one of the big box stores to get treatment for grubs in your lawn, it would always be imidacloprid, which is one of these neonicotinoids. And now more and more they're substituting chlorotraniliprole, which is a different insecticide which really has much, much less effect on bees. So the industry is starting to recognize the importance of this and substitute different materials that are less toxic. So some of the patterns that are emerging here. When we trapped pollen and we looked for neonicotinoids, we found them fairly often, like in 12% of the samples, but we found them at very, very low levels with just very occasional spikes. So it's not clear that that is a critical problem here in Connecticut. And because people have also looked at honeybee survival and found that honeybees can actually survive a level, their colonies can survive a level up to 20 parts per billion pretty well, which was well above what we would normally find in that trapped colony. But they may be more susceptible to some of the other neonicotinoids, thiamethoxam and clothianidin. But there was just a new paper actually came out last week. As I said, there are hundreds of papers coming out all the time. There was a new paper that came out last week that explained about why we see all these sublethal effects on honeybees in the lab, and we haven't really seen the same thing in the same way in honeybee colonies. And so what happens is the foraging bees go out and they're exposed to the pesticides and they don't come back. And so the honeybee colonies, up to a certain point, can continue to deal with that because they can produce more foragers. They just keep more rapidly moving the bees from being nurse bees into being forager bees. So up to a certain point, the honeybees can cope. But what we're now realizing is honeybees are not the canary in the coal mine. They're not the first organisms to respond. The honeybees are more like us in the coal mine, and the bumblebees and the solitary bees are really the canaries in the coal mine. Those are the ones that don't have the ability to keep replacing the foragers when they die. So now the concern is really about bumblebees and solitary bees and what these pesticides might be doing to those. So this is a fact sheet. Again, the link to the fact sheet is in your resource page. This was written actually more than a year ago, but it still basically applies. So protecting bees from pesticides. So as I said, there's a whole range of insecticides that are highly toxic to bees. So you need to make sure that you're very careful in using them. Don't apply them to flowering plants with any kinds of bees on them. And avoid drift. So if you're applying them to some other plant, make sure that they're not drifting onto the plants that the bees would feed on. And then if you're going to use neonicotinoids, make sure that you use them as low an amount as you can with effectiveness, and use them as long as you can before the plants flower. So if you have trees that bloom at one time of year, the best way to use the neonicotinoids would be to apply it right after the tree blooms so that it would be another whole year before the tree blooms again. So that gives it the most time for the insecticide to break down. Okay, and so here are my funders and my cooperators and the people who work for me. And that's the end of my talk. Yeah, I don't know if you want to take questions or if you're time constrained.
We have some time for a question and answer.
Okay.
Nobody's asking.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious, those ground nesters, it looked like some were making their own holes. Do they go into mice holes and rodent holes sometimes for nests, or are they actually taking a grain out at a time and building their own holes?
So there are different strategies for different ones. So bumblebees classically will use old mouse holes. And there are other bees that will use pre-existing holes, but the ones like the Calides that I showed you, They dig their own holes. Yeah. It's hard to believe how these delicate bees are digging their holes 3 feet down sometimes. But they do, yeah, yeah.
Didn't see a lot of bees on my pear trees this year.
Mhm.
I mean, maybe they're little and I didn't see them, but I had a lot of pears on one tree, but not the next one.
Okay, so she says she didn't see a lot of bees on her pear trees. Pears are actually notorious for being difficult to get pollinated well. So some of that is a lack of compatibility between different kinds of pears, but some of it is also that the pears have relatively little resources for bees compared to things like apples. Oftentimes when people call me up and they say, I'm used to seeing larger numbers of bees and I haven't seen them this year, I say, so what's happening with your local beekeeper? Because oftentimes, it changes a lot your perception if, the local beekeeper has just lost his or her colonies or moved them somewhere else or something like that. So that can sort of change the local appearance pretty quickly. And that's partly because people recognize honeybees and they see them pretty readily, but some of the other bees, which can be important pollinators, some of those tiny little sweat bees, people don't recognize or don't see as often, even though they might be there, you don't see them.
Yeah, it was a good year for apples.
Yeah.
A good year for apples.
Any other questions?
The
Yes.
yellow jackets, how do they winter over, if they do at all?
Yellow jackets overwinter more like bumblebees, so it's just the mated queens that overwinter, and they find a space. So they don't necessarily go back to the same space they were before, but they do. It is like the mated queens finding little spaces to hang out over the winter and groom.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you think that a lack of pollination could cause, for example, my cucumbers this year were very brown and like misshapen and yellow? Do you think that would have been from low pollination?
So it's possible that the misshapen cucumbers might be partly from lack of pollination. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of different factors involved. And actually, one of the things I found looking at pumpkins is that mostly the pollination was adequate, but when people had failures of pumpkins, it was due to other things. Sometimes it's actually due to hot, dry weather at a particular time so that the plants aren't producing the flowers or aren't producing the nectar at that time. Yeah. A lot of factors involved.
What type of bee pollinates corn?
So corn is wind pollinated. And so some honeybees will pick up corn pollen. So it's sort of like the maple trees. It's wind pollinated, but there are bees that will use it. And there are other insects that use it too. There's lady beetles that feed on it. There's a lot of actually beneficial insects that feed on corn pollen. But for the most part, it's the wind that carries the pollen.
Our corn crop this year was horrible.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's not an insect pollination issue. Yeah.
Okay.
How about the natural sprays, like there's a Captain Jack's type spray? Does that affect bees at all? Or-
So the question is, what about natural sprays like Captain Jack's? Do those affect bees? So Captain Jack's is actually spinosad. That's the active ingredient. And spinosad is not a systemic, so you don't want to spray it on flowers when the bees are present, because if it makes contact with the bees, it will hurt the bees. But once it's dried, then it's safer for the bees than the systemics. Yes.
Why would bees leave their spinners behind?
Why do bees leave their stinger behind? So, that is a really excellent question, and I don't understand that myself. Why would they do that? When honeybees sting you, the stinger stays in your skin and the abdomen breaks off. And so that bee is not going to make it because she's lost the tip of her abdomen. And there's little venom glands that are still pumping venom into you. So that's why they always say when a bee stings you to scratch out the stinger right away. The honeybee stings you, scratch out the stinger right away. It may just be in terms of the survival of honeybees. What's really important is the survival of the hive and not the survival of the individual bees. So at some point, it became so easy to just get rid of those individual bees that they just die off when they sting you. Yeah. That's a good question, though. Yeah.
I buy a lot of raw honey, and I was wondering have they been testing honey to see if these pesticides are actually turning up in the honey?
So my colleague Brian Eitzer, who does all my pesticide testing, had a project with some bee researchers looking at honey. And he did find the neonicotinoids at low levels in honey. But the levels that affect bees are so much lower than the levels that affect us that it's not likely to ever be a health problem for people. But it is a concern that when you look at bulk honey and the levels of pesticides are at such that it would affect the bees feeding on the honey. Other questions? Yes.
Short of spraying pesticide, think of any way to keep carpenter bees from drilling holes in my house?
Keeping carpenter bees from drilling holes in your house. Yeah, that's a question I get pretty much every time. Their preference is for bare wood, so it helps to some degree. I mean, once they start, it's hard to stop them, but it helps to keep them from starting. If you cover the wood, you make sure like your soffits are all covered with vinyl or painted or all that kind of thing. And once they're in there, you pretty much have to apply a pesticide. The best way to do it is to apply dust pump it like directly into the holes. Mm-hmm. And that way the bees moving around on the inside will come in contact. And that way also you're not spreading it around. I mean, people spray on the outside of their houses and the bees don't even come in contact with the outsides of their houses.
Is that bee any good?
Pardon?
Is that a good bee?
So it is a bee that pollinates, yes. So carpenter bees actually do pollinate. So, they're a good bee as long as they're out there making their holes in logs, or something, not in your houses. Yeah. So that, and then once you've killed the bees, then you want to fill in all those holes and you want to seal it off so that they won't come back, because they will come back. Unlike most other bees, they will come back over and over to that same site and expand those nests.
You
Yes.
should get a tennis racket and just whack them.
No, that's actually a misconception. The carpenter bees that you see, the ones that try and stare you down, those are the males. Those are males defending territory. And so they can't sting you because they're males and a stinger is a modified ovipositor. So it's all bluff. And the females you can't really get with your tennis racket because they're too busy doing their jobs. They're going back and forth, foraging and going to the nests. So those ones that are in your face are actually harmless.
Oh,
and
okay.
if if you know how to recognize them, and they actually have like a yellow patch on their face, if you know how to recognize them, you can impress people by like reaching out and grabbing them. Yes.
Getting back to the stingers, do the males have stingers and just not use them, or do they do not have any?
They do not have stingers.
not.
They do not have stingers. Yeah, yeah. So, that's the way those stingers evolved, is as a separate part of the ovipositor. And since the males don't have any ovipositor, that's the egg laying part of the equipment. Since the males don't have any ovipositor, they don't have any stingers. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Does your beehive recognize you?
Does your beehive recognize
I
you?
mean, if someone came over and bothered the beehive, would they say, oh, you already have a mistake? But if you're friendly to them and you're a keeper, they know who you are.
I don't think that your beehive recognizes you. I think that what happens is that beekeepers develop behaviors that make them less likely to get stung. So in addition to, wearing veils and things like that, when I started working on bees and I would work with the bee inspectors, what I was impressed by is they would move very slowly and deliberately, because bees react to sudden movement. And so, there's a certain sort of being very calm. It's actually sort of a meditative activity. I think that's one reason why lots of people like to do it. You remain very calm and you move slowly and thoughtfully. You don't sort of unnecessarily jar anything or shake anything. And you also make sure you don't wear any flowery perfumes or shampoo or deodorant or any of that stuff. And so that's partly how beekeepers make it so that they are less likely to get stung.
Can the bees hear you if you talk to them?
Can the bees hear you if you talk to them? I don't know. I don't know the answers. Yeah, you may not be speaking in the right frequency. Any other questions? Well, you've asked me something I don't usually get asked. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.